And I started following him, and I started seeing people mentioning him or having discussions with him. And so I've probably been stalking him, I think now, for about a year and a half, saying we really need to get him to campus. This is somebody who really knows what they're talking about. And it's funny, I asked George, like, what do you want your bio to be today? And he's like, I don't know, there's lots of things people say about me, but, whatever you want. And I think that's just more illustrative of why George is really great. So I was like, well, I'm going to come up with a bio of what I would say about George. So first of all, he's definitely a Canadian. And you can tell that in conversation with him and the way that he thinks that whenever you come to the US, you should definitely be wearing shorts and sandals, because even in Wisconsin, it's really hot here. I was surprised that he wore a suit jacket today. I was definitely expecting shorts and sandals. And we all understand that around here as well, because when is it 80 degrees in Wisconsin? We just think it's a heat wave these last few days. I think he's funny and he's down to earth and he's authentic. He tells you what he thinks. And it's about emerging technologies and innovations, and he's not quick to jump on the bandwagon or be swayed by any vendor or political agenda. And so, and at the end of the day, I think that his message can be very informative to us. But officially, these are all the things they say about him on Wikipedia. He's going to love this. So he's a writer, a theorist, a speaker, a researcher on learning, networks, technology, analytics, and visualization, openness and organizational effectiveness in digital environments. And there's a citation in case you want to look that up. Also, he's the originator of connectivism theory and the author of the article, Connectivism, A Learning Theory for the Digital Age, and the book, Knowing Knowledge, an exploration of the impact of the changed context and characteristics of knowledge. So, at the end of the day, he's a Canadian who knows what he's talking about. So, George?
Thanks very much, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here, and she's absolutely right. I mean, if I had my choice, I would be shorts and sandals all the way. But when I meet with a new group of folks that I don't know, there's sort of a mandate to try and at least be marginally presentable. And in terms of bios, I mean, the best bio I ever read was actually the founder of Plone, which used to be a content management system. He had this big, long bio, and at the end it said, and he has the charisma and good looks that can only come from writing your own bio. And so, I want to talk about a variety of things. I'm going to talk fairly quick. I was at a session in Madison yesterday, and at the end a gentleman came up to me, he's from Europe, and he says, the best thing about MOOC software, he said, is you can slow down the speaker when they're going too fast. And so I may end up going a little bit quick on a few of these points, but I'm assuming some of these you have familiarity with, because it's really been a point where education has entered the public space in a way that I can never recall it being. Education in the past, I think, has been you go to university, you get your degree, you go to the workforce, you might write a few checks back to your system, and that's sort of it. Maybe you go back and do a few refresher courses, but do a reunion, those kinds of things. But today, education is absolutely everywhere. It's in NBC, it's ABC, it's on the cover of New York Times, it's on the cover of the Times Magazine. I mean, you can't get away from education, particularly you can't get away from things like MOOCs, flipped classroom, Khan Academy, and those kinds of things. And so I want to take a slightly different slant on a few of these things, and I'm going to talk about a variety of factors that are change pressure related. Why are we sort of where we are? And secondly, once I sort of done a quick review of that, I want to start looking at what are the differences that are actually consequential. What are some of the changes happening that are significant? Because where we have MOOCs today, in the past we had Open Courseware Initiative. And where we had Open Courseware Initiative, we used to have distance learning. And where we had distance learning, we used to have TV instruction, University of the Air and so on. So I want to try and get a bit of a sense on, what is it that's consequential so that we're not necessarily distracted by this heavy MOOC hype. And unfortunately, the MOOC hype is starting to deflate a little bit, so I think that's a good thing. We're less nonsensical in our discussion about MOOCs and more strategic and more focused. And I mean, let's face it, when you get a guy like Tom Friedman to give you a really nuanced thought of MOOCs in the New York Times, that really helps. Okay, that whole part was sarcasm. All right, so what we're seeing in education then, this is my broad argument, is that learning needs are more complex than they've ever been. And the narrative that we have of higher education, or that we have had until now, this narrative, you get a degree, you get a job, you have a middle-class life. That narrative doesn't suffice anymore because the learning needs are too broad to really be encapsulated with that narrative. And perhaps most substantially, the impact of this is that the idea of a university is expanding. The idea of a university is becoming more integrated on many levels in all aspects of society. Now, what we're seeing with MOOCs and a variety of these systems or emerging ed tech approaches is essentially there's a shadow education system, and that's been developing for a long period of time. And it's a quite simple reason for the development. When you have periods of rapid change, stable systems have challenge adjusting. When I was at the University of Manitoba, I met with a faculty member in our School of Computing, and she had her third-year students write the Java textbook for her first-year students in a wiki, just as her learning activity. And it was a great activity, but she didn't do it only for the learning opportunities. She did it for A, textbooks are insanely expensive, but B, also because the textbook providers weren't current fast enough, because the textbook publication process just took too long. So in some regards, getting these emerging areas of interest, some of it's hype and nonsense and BS, and some of it's relevant and significant, but getting it into the school system doesn't always work well, because if you want to develop a master's program, you're looking at a 2, 3, 4-year process to get it through various regulatory procedures and so on. So if you look at it, big data and analytics, which right now is a fairly significant buzzword, and I think there's some substance there, that's really been around about 3 years now, when the first Strata conference was held and really started ramping up this idea. So that means that even now there are limited programs addressing this subject area, but in response there have been a variety of systems that have offered anything from informal self-accredited certificates to online courses that you can join to get a sense of, to workshops and so on. So this is what I would call a shadow education system. And the university up until now has kind of ignored that shadow education system because, well, we're a university, we don't have to deal with stuff like that. And so now, in MOOCs in some of these regards aren't necessarily direct competition with university, but we're getting to this point where, I mean, and I don't know, picture Moses coming down from the mountain or something here, but it's getting this sense of the university among us, right? Where we're recognizing that the university isn't a separate place from life. It's not something you go to for 4, 5, 6 years and then get on with life, but it's a place that now starts to be prevalent in every aspect of life. Just a quick example of this is what IMF announced yesterday, which was they're going to be running a MOOC on the edX platform, helping educate people about monetary policy so that there are informed consumers, because it's kind of consequential what's happening in some of the monetary sectors. So this is just an example of this notion of pushing education out more broadly and finding systems that can capture emerging trends. That's substantial for a variety of reasons. Probably the most significant, though, is that in the US right now, less than half of students are considered full-time students. That is a substantial transition from what we had even a decade or 2 decades ago, which means that, as I mentioned, we're seeing this complexification and diversification of the education sector. One of the fastest growing forms of credentialing is our certificates. And the reason they're developing quickly, I think, is largely due to the fact that they're industry facing and they respond quickly to trends. There's some issues with it, no doubt, but I'm just saying there's ways that the system is waking up to this changed education market. We're seeing the argument being made that, MOOCs are going to challenge traditional education, and I would view no, traditional education is going to be as it is, but it's all this peripheral stuff, these other trends developing around it that MOOCs are really starting to provide and address. Now what this has done as well is it's created this changed context in how we think about education. This sense of, maybe we need to rethink what education's role is in society. Maybe we should ditch the college for all crusade. And part of the reason, if you look 60 years ago where you've got low education attainment rates, and to now most societies in developed parts of the world are ranging anywhere from 40 up to about 60% post-secondary achievement by their population, you have a far broader set of needs for students that the system has to address. So now I'm going to just briefly address a few change pressures. Needless to say, economics is probably the most substantive because that just impacts everything we do. In the US, you've had 2 states, Wyoming and North Dakota, that have had an increase in funding since 2008. Every other state, from Arizona looking at 50%, right down to North Carolina, still 15% reduction in costs. Alaska was low at 3.2. but virtually every state has suffered in terms of public funding. In this regard, I think it's a valid point that some folks make, which is that we don't have a public crisis of the education system. We have a reduction of public funding, which has racked up tuition. Because whenever you see one of these charts, I don't think I have one in this one, but whenever you see one of those where it says, look at how much tuition has gone up, it's way more than housing costs. Well, you have to intelligently follow that slide with the reason why it's gone up is because we've seen an enormous reduction of state level support for these university systems. So it's not that tuition has gone up dramatically, it's that public support for education has gone down dramatically. All right, so this is sort of the context of, reduced state funding, but economically we have an interesting transition. Don't worry about this chart, there's lots of little squares on it. What I'm trying to address with this is the more education you have, the better chance you had of being employable right from 2008. So from your right, virtually every sector, with the exception of finance, and it could be argued they deserved it, has had a net increase in employment if you have a graduate degree or more. On the other hand, virtually every, and this is, keep in mind, this is even in manufacturing and construction sectors, higher levels of education resulted in increased growth of job opportunities right through the recession, as mentioned with the exception of finance. But on the other hand, if you're looking at work experience or even some vocational training, almost every sector has had a net decrease in employment opportunities. So it is an economy that values employment or that values education more than it ever has. By the way, how many of you heard of Peter Thiel's project where he had, drop out of school, take an X number of dollars and create a project or a business? It's a great idea, I guess. But what was funny was that he had in his company, they have this, they were hiring a position, exact time that this was going on, the position said they were only looking for Ivy League applicants. So it's quite interesting. It's one of these things, we'll do this with your life, but when we want something important accomplished, we still want this level of educational attainment. What's substantial here, though, is that the education, the economy is transitioned. Now, I don't think this is new for anyone, but the economy is now not a production or construction or manufacturing economy. It's very much what we've long heard about as being a knowledge economy. And so we're looking at interaction jobs, which are creative-oriented work, and transaction jobs, which are service industry work. Now, in developed economies, particularly like the US, now are by far the largest part of the economy. In emerging regions of the world, production jobs are still most significant. So we're at a point where knowledge matters more than it has ever mattered. Having a quality education has had a bigger impact on a person's success than it has ever had. And yet, we're seeing public interest in supporting this kind of a system dwindle dramatically in 2003-ish or so, where generally the transition was made, and since 2008 it's really accelerated, of reduction in investment in the public system. Not universal, because you see parts of the world, namely China and other regions, that now have a greater number of students than any other country in the world. And also the spending in China is going up almost exponentially year over year. So there are regions of the world that are trying to get into the knowledge economy that are investing very heavily. Now I want to talk, with that, just sort of a bit of backdrop. So my argument is, just in case you didn't see what I was trying to say because I said it too vaguely, my argument is the economy has changed. Our university system is not broken. Our university system is doing exactly what it needs to do. The difficulty, though, now is that there is a mismatch between the structure of the economy and the knowledge needs of society and the role that the university plays. A series of shadow markets around education have emerged in response to that. The university needs to expand its mission and its focus in order to address that market. And so I'm going to talk now about what I think are a series of substantive changes that are actually going to make an impact. Ones that it's not a bad idea to pay attention to. First of all, openness. And this is something you've all heard about. It's been prominent really since the late 90s. There was some work by folks like David Wiley, who started with an open content license that was eventually transitioned into a Creative Commons license. It also helped set the framework for what happened with MIT's Open Courseware initiative in 2002, 2003, and since then it's moved into everything from open scholarship, open publishing, open science. So basically openness right now, it looks like in almost all sectors, the 50% plus in face-to-face and online programs use open educational resources. So 50% plus of the systems in the US are using some kind of open education resource. This is from a stat from 2011, so I'm assuming that's probably, by the way, if anybody wants slides, I have all the footnotes and the sources for these. I'll share it with Tanya, so if anybody wants access to the footnotes to validate this, feel free. So anyways, the point is, more systems are using open educational resources as part of their curricular offerings. From a science perspective, we've seen a stunning increase in open science. And it makes sense. I mean, the sense that we get publicly funded researchers to do research, we submit that to a journal where academics in that field evaluate the article and do the peer review without fee. And then once that's been done, all the free labor has put in, we buy it back from the system that we did the free work for. So it's a neat model. But it's changing, and there's greater interest with open journal system and those kinds of models now, open scholarship, and part of the value is, even NSA, just read an article this morning, and I know NSA, hi guys, so even with NSA, the reason they were able to ramp up their analytics platform as quickly as they did was because they relied very heavily on open source software. Commercial proprietors couldn't provide their needs rapidly enough, so they used things like Hadoop and other open systems that allowed them to do what they needed to do in that very short period of time where they had to address some significant intelligence issues. So even there you're seeing systems that have a huge need for privacy still benefit from openness, collaborative kind of approaches. Now, one of the areas that have gained a huge amount of attention, and in fairness, MOOCs, I think, they're not insignificant, but they're not as significant as they're talked about in some levels. I think they're just an instantiation of trends. They reflect a certain kind of trend that's important for us to think about societally because of, again, this shadow education market. So it's gone up. I mean, just this morning, edX tweeted they have now crossed 1 million learners in their system, and Coursera has stated they're sitting at 3.9 million students in their system right now. Now, unfortunately, this is how MOOCs are being assessed. And so this is called a politician's syllogism, which is, we must do something. This is something, this being MOOCs, therefore we must do this. And so that's part of the reason why this attention on MOOCs, because again, I've never seen something ramp up that rapidly and receive that level of adoption. I've never seen state governors talk about, the pedagogical needs for social network learning in our courses, but they say, oh, we got to do MOOCs. So anyway, it's fascinating. But faculty are saying, you know what, wait a second, this MOOC stuff's getting a little out of hand. There's some issues with access. Who owns this content? What happens if I create my content in a MOOC? Do I lose rights to that? Faculty are starting to say, no, actually, wait a second, we don't have to jump on this bandwagon. There are some issues here that we're not comfortable with. We want them addressed first. Systems like Harvard are saying, wait, we want oversight of edX or these MOOC systems that are being funded by the universities where we're doing our academic work. And even now, MOOCs have started to become less immortal than they were even a few months ago, namely with Coursera's initiative to basically be a content provider to a variety of state college systems or public institutions. Now, but one of the big things around MOOCs is this notion of eventedness. This is, I think, why they've gained so much traction, is because there's a starts and stop period in them, which then helps to drive some interest and generate some awareness. But largely speaking, MOOCs enshrine and optimize and instantiate the education system of the past, meaning that it helps to make more efficient, a system that I don't think is relevant anymore. Because as I mentioned, our economic needs are not for, can you memorize knowledge and repeat back to me what I already know, namely production type of work. Our economic needs, and not just, and I know education is about more than the economy, but they're centered around creativity, around generation, around creating something new and different. So what MOOCs do right now is they give us the education system we needed 30 years ago. And that's reflected well with Carl Jasper's statement on the idea of the university from a book in 1959, where he stated, people used to be way more cynical back then, but when they were cynical, it sounded so nice. So he stated that both student and teacher are unhappy when chained to curricula and syllabi, to tests and mediocre standards. Uninspiring common sense produces satisfactory mastery of know-how and testable factual information, but it stifles genuine understanding and a spirit of adventure and research. And I think that's as applicable to MOOCs as any statement I've ever heard. So that's just a little bit of background. There's this huge trend in openness, the trend one I want to look at. MOOCs are a flavor of that, but in fairness, they need to be driven more by creativity and knowledge generation. Second substantial trend, I'm going to run through a couple of these quickly, is social network learning, participatory pedagogy, pick whatever language you want to use. This is vastly oversimplified, but historically we've had something that looks a little bit like this. There's our content in our discipline, here's our learners. As faculty, part of our job is to get this content into some meaningful way into the learner's head, and then we evaluate her understanding of that content through what we look at as traces of knowledge, namely tests, exams, and so on. Now, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, those tests and exams don't actually evaluate the knowledge. There was an interesting video done called A Private Universe that met with on campus at graduation day at Harvard, and they asked a group of students, why do we have seasons? And the vast majority of the students couldn't answer that question. They've graduated Harvard, elite system in the world, and their view was that we have seasons for just a huge range of faulty reasons. And so I thought, that is fascinating. So I think what it really tells us is that we are not testing students necessarily on the consequential matters of conceptual awareness, but instead they've learned to play the game and give us the answers that they know will be on the test. So today the system perhaps looks a little bit more like this, and again I'm simplifying it just to make a point. In the past, a good faculty member would argue, oh wait a second, I already brought in external speakers and did things like that, and they did. But by and large, the system is moving from something a little more like this to something where we're bringing peripheral learners, external learners, open education resources, co-created content, and so on. So our class experience, and I noticed this several years ago with courses I was teaching in Moodle at the time. In the past, somebody would put the focus would be the readings that were assigned that week. That was the object of discussion for the week. Now all of a sudden we have our weekly readings released, and what do we get instead? We get, oh hey, have you guys seen this TED Talk video? Or I read this article over here in this open access journal, I read this over there. So what's happening now is that the readings that I used to think were the object that we were going to be discussing have now become a part of the course, but learners are augmenting and adding a series of additional resources that dig deeper or at least diversify what I was trying to communicate. And another significant aspect of this is the Maker Faire movement, or the Maker movement, which just emphasizes do stuff. Right? And this is reflected even in MIT's first year physics course, which used to be more instruction lecture oriented, but have now become more so you just get together, it's in a lab, you experiment and do things rather than listen to someone like you are. Another point is technology. So this is a trend, and I'm going to run through a couple of these really fast now, but technology has changed significantly, he says, to the gasp of everyone who hadn't thought of this. And so we're seeing this, certainly the ramp up of the use of mobile devices, looking at over 10 billion units, mobile units right now, add the Internet of Things to that once that sort of makes its footprint known. And all of a sudden you look at a very significant landscape of computing that we just haven't had in the past. And that means even now, I think that Tanya's example earlier about, where you had cameras and whatever else set up last year, and so now you can have a simple iPad. The costs of production of content have gone so low. One example, I don't have a chart here, but I use in periodic presentation about Encarta, the encyclopedia. When they first brought it out, they did some focus groups, and people were saying, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I get videos and I get images. This is way better than World Book or whatever it is you had at home. And so they asked, what would you pay? And they're saying like $1,500, $2,000. It's a very valuable resource. They launched it for the incredibly low price of $300. And it kept going down and down and down every year in terms of price. By the time they closed Encarta, which was I think in 2003 or 2004, somewhere in there, they were selling it for $19.95. And $19.95 was not allowing them to sell enough. And they couldn't sell it. People didn't want to pay $19.95 because they can get a lot of this for free. Now, as a result of that, from an economic end and from a growth of the technology sector, we've enabled rapid expansion in e-learning and online learning, whereas much of the traditional university is looking at 5, 6, 7% growth rates in most parts of the world. Some are way bigger and some are actually contracting now. The online learning space, in contrast, though, is growing enormously. Very rapid growth in those spaces. And that's similarly reflected in the number of students that are involved in online programs. From 2002, where we had less than 10%, and these are some stats from Sloan C, to 2010, where it's over 30%, and now 3 years later, I would imagine we're probably sitting at 50% plus in online course complete activity for students in the system. And a few final quick points is the growth of cloud computing. As Tanya mentioned, you're using Google Docs for collaborating and sharing. And it's just when you think of how insignificant that particular invention really was, it basically takes Microsoft Word back about a decade. But the fact, well, it does, but the fact that you can quickly collaborate without, emailing and sharing documents and do something together, what we needed is not advanced features in Word that allow us to do amazing things, but instead we needed a system where we could easily connect. And so that's the benefit of cloud computing that's really made a lot of that available for us. Finally, in this subject area of technology, mobile devices are probably among the most significant ones now. And that's just the launch of tools like tablets and smartphones, and as a result, sort of the erosion of the Wintel monopoly. A few additional points related to entrepreneurship and startup. Again, I'm trying to isolate what are trends that are substantive. So startups, it's really the gold rush of the technology space right now. So those delightful Silicon Valley folks that have freed journalism from its terrible pain and suffering, and that have freed the music industry, they're now freeing the education industry. And by free, I mean make money from. And so as a result of that, we're seeing huge interest in these kinds of spaces. And that's reflected in the number of venture capital deals being closed now. The number of deals and the dollar value of deals are now exceeding the pre-dot-com crash era. A lot of people with a lot of money are seeing education as virgin territory. And some of the wealthiest companies really getting to be in society have an educational presence. Pearson, Apollo Group, and others, McGraw-Hill, they have a substantial footprint in the education sector. And just a quick illustration, Apollo Group, they're a private company, so it's hard to validate sometimes, but they stated that they've spent over $100 million in the last year improving their pedagogical models. Right? I mean, what public university has spent that kind of money on improving teaching and software? So it's an interesting development with this presence of the for-profit private companies. In some cases, these companies are there to take advantage, or not to take advantage, they use the word partner, but they want to help the education system become better. And so for Western Governors, for example, they have an arrangement with McGraw-Hill where if you don't pass, you don't pay full cost for a textbook, right? So they're starting to disperse some of the risks within these kinds of systems. And we're going to see more and more of this. I mean, we're just at the early stages of this, but definitely, and I'm not saying it's all negative, but we already have significant corporate presence in education. If you're in IT, for example, I'm pretty sure you didn't build your own servers on the weekend, and chances are that you're working with companies that help enable a lot of what you do as a system. So I'm not saying that the for-profit activity is inherently negative, but I'm saying it's something to pay attention to, because there are some that see it as an opportunity to generate revenue rather than help learners. At South by Southwest this last year, in January, whenever that was, February, one individual had asked someone on a panel, had said, what about the learners? And this person who was the head of this company had a brilliant statement that a colleague of ours tweeted that said, well, we do worry about learning outcomes and learning objectives, but first we worry about our shareholders. And so there's it's a different mindset and a focus, right? So that's what I'm saying. So I'm trying to emphasize the for-profit sector is really good as long as the education sector is leading. But if the for-profit sector leads, then you have a different skewed metrics.
Oh, I just wanted to comment on the for-profit sector and the fact that their stocks are all down over the past year because of regulatory pressures. And the reason that Apollo is investing $100 million in its learning outcomes is not of the goodness of their heart. It's because they're having to, or they'll be out of business. And in fact, Milwaukee has seen several, Kaplan and the other people who have left, formally rolled up and just left the market in Milwaukee because they can't meet the regulatory hurdle of graduating students. So.
No, it's great. And I should mention, if anybody has comments, questions as I'm going, raise your hand and jump in. So thanks for the comments. Okay, another point, learning analytics. I think they're substantive. If you spend any time, watching good old Netflix, what's interesting to note there is every time you pause, every time you fast forward, every time you rewind, Netflix is watching. And they're using that. They're not, their script writing is now driven by, if we have, a 6-second romance scene, that's kind of about the limit till the guys drop off. So if we're targeting males, we've got to keep it to about 5 seconds, but we need about a 30-second violence scene to compensate. And so their writing is being driven by analytics and feedback that they're putting forward. And that's what Bruno Latour has addressed, where he says, the slightest move in the virtual landscape is paid for in lines of code or in data that's captured. Now this data does a lot. It can reveal our sentiments, our attitudes, our social connections, what we're going to do. And even Eric Schmidt, formerly CEO of Google, he stated, our real goal is we want to get to the point where we know what you're going to do before you do it, right? Where we know what you're going to search for before you know what you want to search for. So very humble ambitions. And so, but there's been a variety of systems. When applied to the education sector, there's a variety of things that have actually worked quite well, where you can use analytics for either personalized adaptive learning, and I think that's something that's on the agenda of one of the unconference sessions. The Open Learning Initiative at CMU, their stats course is commonly an example. Simple tools like Snap, which allows you to do, plugs into a browser, and you can do a social network analysis of Desire to Learn, Moodle, or Blackboard discussion forums. Or Produce Signals, which is a simple tool that provides feedback to students on where are they and what do they need to do to keep moving forward. Another example is Degree Compass. Degree Compass is a system that was developed by Austin Peay University, but has since been acquired by Desire to Learn. And it's basically a recommender system, the way that Amazon book systems recommend. Oh, you read this, you did this, you're going to like this. And so it's just there to help a student select which course should you take next, and provide recommendation that says, with your profile, if you take this course, it's going to be a little shaky, but if you take this one first and then take that other one, then you'll be fine. And getting down to a few of the final points on these 7 points, it's the granularization of learning, where I think we're moving from courses to competencies or from courses to something smaller. And this has been reflected through ACE and other systems that have said we need to take advantage of learning that happens outside of a classroom. All of this still ties back to the diversification of the economy and the expanding role that the university plays in this space. Now this may be contentious here, but I'll just emphasize this one example of competency-based learning with the UW flexible degree option, Western Governors universities in this space as well. And there have been a variety of companies and growing number of reports that emphasize competency-based learning and the need for us to get to a more granular unit of assessment. So instead of a degree at the end of taking a physics course, wouldn't it be nice if you could have granularized assessment of what students did at each of those particular spaces? All right, so for the last 8 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about futures of education. So if you look at some of the factors I looked at, different trends that are consequential, differences that I think will make a difference, then what's the education system going to look like going forward? Now, there's a lot of talk about the end of the university and that residential college campuses are going to be obsolete, a whack of university profs are going to lose their jobs, and Harvard in 10 years will have 10 million students. Or you have other folks that are, and this is Professor Lewin from MIT, who's made the statement that we have 10,000 colleges in the US. A lot of them at the very bottom are, in a very flattering term, worth nothing, and that most of these will disappear. It may take a period of time, but it's going to happen. There's going to be half the U.S. university systems or college systems are going to close. They're just not doing good quality work. Of course, in this case, MOOCs are the solution. So I was encouraged to see the Committee on Institutional Cooperation that recently, or just yesterday, actually published a report that said, wait a second, we don't want to outsource our core competencies, namely teaching, learning, content development to for-profit providers. We'll happily work with for-profit providers where it makes sense for us and where it supports our mission, but we don't want to give something as central to our mission as educating people over to Coursera or other systems. That's why I had a brief chat this morning with Tanya, when she was mentioning that the MOOC initiative here is different approach where you're working with an LMS provider, but you retain control of the content, you retain control of the space. It's a much more strategic vision of doing MOOCs than saying, well, let's join Coursera. And so ultimately, I'll make the argument in the next couple slides that if an education system fails to emulate the attributes of knowledge or of information in a particular area, it's doomed to fail. Which means that if you try and create a system that doesn't align with what a society does with information, then your system isn't sustainable. Right? So if you want to understand what does the future of the education system look like, you have to look at what are we doing with information today that we perhaps haven't done in the past. And historically, the argument would be, and McNeely and Wolverton in their book Reinventing Knowledge make exactly this argument, which is that society's knowledge institutions have always mapped to or mirrored what a society does with information in that era. Whether it's the Library of Alexandria or the development of the printing press, which produced library classification systems and so on, and the academy and these kinds of activities. So what you do with information in an era will determine the knowledge institutions that you need. And I'm saying information today is, hence we need this type of a system, open, distributed, scalable, generative, self-organized, and so on. So here's a few quick options. First of all, status quo. This is what the university might look like. The risk level is somewhat high on this because the biggest point I think is there's a loss of relevance. Now, I'm not saying that the core knowledge needs the university serves today are going to go away immediately. I think they will continue to be there, but they will continue to be a smaller and smaller part of the overall learning needs within society. So it's essentially the challenge or the risk of taking this kind of approach of status quo, which I see happening in some systems where there's really a barrier to walk or a line to walk between these systems are very significant, that MOOCs are going to change the whole world, versus ignoring what's happening, right? So I don't think you want to be on either side of those pendulum swings, but you do want to be more thoughtful and coherent in the approach you take. So status quo, I think, is challenging. Another one is to basically become accreditors, and this has been emphasized by a few systems already, where they're going to teach globally, accredit locally. You can take MOOCs wherever you want, we'll just give you a stamp of approval and give you the certificate when you're done. And this isn't a bad strategy, but unfortunately one of the things that it does do is you lose control of teaching, because suddenly the university becomes a place that stamps knowledge rather than a place that helps to develop and communicate and research. There's going to be a significant loss of brand if this approach goes on. Another one is localized and specialized knowledge. This is actually not a bad strategy because it emphasizes there are things that your system here does locally that's unique. There are academic programs that you excel at that are probably among the best in the country or even the best in the world. So it's really about saying, but unfortunately what this does do is it reduces the overall size of the university system because you start to play to your specialized needs. And we have this right now in Alberta. We have a Minister of Education who has stunning hair, he thinks. And no, really it is. If you search our Minister of Education, Alberta Minister of Education and hair, you'll understand. In fact, he was in a meeting with university presidents and was busy tweeting about how nice his hair looked that day. So while they were talking about him cutting 10% from the university system, it was fascinating. So this strategy is one of the things that they're trying to do in Alberta at least, which is to say, you know what, we don't want 500 intro to philosophy courses in the province. We want one, right? We want to kill that diversification, normalize, do a specialized thing, and then each system does their specialized activity, and you borrow from others who are better at what they do than you are. I don't think this is a great model. On the one hand, it's good for smaller local systems, but it's going to be for larger systems that have a big imprint in a state, it's going to be a difficult model. Another one is the partnership model, and this is one that's increasingly gaining attention because and one example was the announcement that was made with Georgia Tech and AT&T, where they're going to do a master's degree in computer science for $6,000. So this is that kind of an illustration, and AT&T funded the initial offering of this course to the tune of about $2 million. But really this is a model where you say, there are certain corporate needs, we got to address those, and this is how we're going to approach it. So the partnership model is relevant, it's politically relevant, perhaps more importantly, because unfortunately for a variety of reasons, higher education has been reduced to serving the economic needs of society. There's more to it than that, there's the social needs of a society. But it's easier to sell, get a job, than it is have a democratic society. And so the final model I'll put forward, and this is one that I think sort of is where I hopefully see things evolve, which is sort of this network integrative model, where the goal here is to really focus on what is it that the role that we play in society, and then being the space where we pull together learning from a variety of spaces, and also where we provide adaptive, personalized learning, whether it's algorithmically driven through software, or whether it's the kind of activity that we do. So students can learn in MOOCs, and they can learn in TED Talks, and they can do self-regulated learning and studying, but there's something about the social experience and the connection to being involved, the cultural development, where the university becomes, as I mentioned earlier, the university among us. It becomes central to many aspects of society, not just to getting a degree. It's something where when students who have a reputation or a relationship to university come back and say, yes, that's the system that I want to be a part of. I went to UW Milwaukee, I got my degree there, and now that I'm transitioning into a new role in my workplace, I'm going to continue to get degrees. I might take MOOCs as marketing tactics for the university, but help build a relationship with me and as an alum to the system. It's really about developing your brand, and the university becomes the new integrator, right? Because a bit of a challenge that we see societally is that as much fun as it is to take education and fragment it down to its individual chunks, you can't act in fragmentary environments. When you don't have a cohesive whole of the subject or a cohesive view, you're screwed, because it's tough to see, what do I do next? What's important? What's consequential? And so a role of a university in this sense is to be able to provide that integration space for information and knowledge that recognizes there's learning happening in all kinds of spaces, but that recognizes the importance of learner guidance and learner support systems that actually allow them to form coherent knowledge views of those topics. And that's something that other systems are right now primarily provisioning information rather than providing an opportunity for deep knowledge integration and coherence in those discipline areas. Thanks.
We can have some time for questions. Do you guys have questions for George? Chris?
George, you kind of started out by saying that the university, broadly speaking, isn't broken, and then told us about a lot of things that it needed to change. So I guess is it broken or not?
Well, no, the university isn't broken. Maybe I didn't communicate that clearly enough. For what the university has been designed to do in society, it's not broken. It is mismatched, though, to the knowledge needs of society. So my point is, there's a lot of people, the classic image, you'll see a presentation, somebody will come up and say, oh look, this is a classroom in 1892. This is a classroom today. Look how little universities have changed. It's kind of like saying, look, in 1892 this was an ocean. Now look at the ocean today. It hasn't changed. It's kind of like, okay, so my point was, the way the university is structured to deal with knowledge, to disseminate, to share, to create, to research, to enculturate youth, it does those things very well. The problem is that because society as a whole and the knowledge needs of society are changing, globalized world, transparency, all these other factors start to come in, the university, to retain its relevance in those systems, has to begin broadening its scope. But as a system, I don't think it's broken, because it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do for society. Until now.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. You talked about analytics a little bit, and this kind of has to do with online education. At UWM, as a student, I've taken a number of online classes, and I think the biggest complaint I have is, it's less individualized. And I think when you go to analytics and people start relying on analytics, your course content is being modified and adhere to the highest common denominator. Is that getting even further away from the individual? Are we kind of missing the point, just relying heavily on analytics? And then how would you, gear online content towards an individual, actually get to the point where you want it to be?
And I think that's actually, you have a session on this today, so I'm assuming a lot of that conversation will happen there, but let me just quickly as an illustration. So MOOCs are content providers right now. That's with Coursera's move, that's essentially what they became. And even now with Udacity's agreements with San Jose State and their agreement with Georgia Tech, they've become a content provider, not a replacement, somebody that replaced the education system. So for universities, what becomes relevant and valuable, personalization and adaptation works when there's a right answer. This is content personalization, right? So you can't personalize the discovery of art. You can personalize the discovery of math and algorithms and scientific concepts because there's a right answer, right? You can look at my answer, math, and you can create a concept inventory of physics concepts, And roughly this is how personalization works for effective companies. There's learning styles personalization, which sucks, but there's a few other ones. But the one that's significant is if you create a profile of a learner, and that learner profile is a knowledge inventory. You don't want to look at affective measures as much because they change day to day. So you create a profile of what does George know. Then you have a secondary semantic mapping of the concepts in an intro physics course. So now George comes to physics, and you have a learning profile because you've tracked what I've done in different courses in the university, perhaps even high school. And then I get to this course, and now what you do as a university system is you don't give me a Physics 101 course. You give me these and these and these modules from that course because I've already communicated that I understand these and these and these topics. So that's effective personalization, and that's what companies like Newton try to do with in the higher education market. Companies like Dreambox have tried to do in the K-12 sector. But as I mentioned, this only works for subject areas where there is a right answer.
Yeah, I think too you can personalize the experience as well, of the actual course, taking the course as well.
There are things, now this is where you now start to get into academic concepts, right? Because perhaps I demonstrate by my learning style or learning disposition that I really like to watch video. Now, that doesn't mean that that's a good thing. What that means is that maybe I really need to do more text. And maybe I need to get better understanding because I'm going to spend the rest of my life communicating with text. So when you personalize it, you want to look at, are you personalizing for knowledge development? Or, because let's face it, there's no way to learn a complex subject. It's never going to be as easy as running through meadows. Like, learning is the formation of new neural pathways, and that takes time and effort and frustration and struggle sometimes. And so personalization, you always have to emphasize, are you producing something that helps the learner understand an idea better, or are you just trying to make it easier so the learner stays happy?
All right, thank you.
All right.
Everyone, thank you, George. All right. We will start our first concurrent session at 11:15. A couple of things. First of all, we still have tons of danishes, bagels, and fruit over here in the solarium and coffee, so grab some things before you head to the sessions. Our first